So 300, 400 years ago, at a time when the world was starting to become a bit more global, the age of enlightenment was here, and Europeans started to build bigger boats to cross bigger oceans. And most of European governments at the time were feudalistic, and which means that largely when it comes to the government of the people, the main economic policy of government was really to enrich the nation, which for most feudalistic economies probably saw the nation as the monarch and the lords, the nobles, and the main economic policy was mercantilism, which was essentially the policy of heading around the world and plundering. That is, economic success was how much gold you could bring into your coffers. And one of the main ways in which this was achieved was through exporting as much as you could and importing as little as you could. So government, monarchs, etc., looked to increase national wealth through policies that limited imports and maximized exports. Now, then the Industrial Revolution hit, and we started to get not just a revolution in the way we produce things, but also a revolution in politics and economics. We moved to more capitalist systems, and in particular, we moved into the age of liberal economics, led by Adam Smith and other philosophers of the time. But the main idea in the next phase of government policy was to slowly start to open up economies, and instead of focusing on maximizing exports, the idea was to look for win-win solutions around the world through trade, in particular looking for comparative advantage around the world and specializing in that which your country was good at producing, exporting as much of that, and importing what others were good at producing. And so we moved into this phase of economic growth, again driven by industrial efficiencies, driven by freer movement of capital, driven by individual freedoms, individual property rights in particular. And from a government point of view, policy started to change to free economies. And in particular, maybe it's a good idea for government to stay out of industry. Let industry do what it does. Now, that all came to a head 100 years ago after we had some wars culminating in the Great War, World War One. Then we had the boom of the 20s, which may have been this peak of, let's say, laissez-faire type of economic policy. And then it all came crumbling down with the Great Depression. Yeah, there was now a sense that the existing economic consensus of fully liberal economies, that there could be downsides. And I would say that it wasn't just because of the Great Depression. We had plenty of criticism. If you go back to the 19th century, look at philosophers such as Marx, for example. the ills, let's say, of unregulated capitalism were understood, but it took the Great Depression to really push through the idea broadly that this system perhaps needs a little bit more hand-holding than what we might have hoped. And so, in particular, in the West, the consensus slowly changed to one of statism, one of growing regulation, growing bureaucracy, in an effort to, in particular, avoid great depressions. Yeah, the idea was without regulation, the economic cycles could get out of control. We could hit booms, big booms and bust cycles, and that the remedy to that was for economic policy to come in. And so we moved into a period from the 1930s to the 1970s, led by Keynesian philosophy, and that is that governments can flatten out that business cycle, flatten it out in a way that avoids these big, this big roller coaster ride that can occur. And when it comes to the roller coaster ride, everybody loves the big ups, let's say, but the downs is what we really don't like. We hate the downs more than we like the ups. And so, yes, through government stimulus during times of economic slumps, that could help lift up the economy, help get employment back to full employment. That is, everybody who wants a job can get a job. That, yes, we won't have to suffer through these types of depressions again. But this did come at a cost. That is, it would require government to take out from the economy in times of excessiveness, exuberance. And, perhaps it's just the cynic in me, but this is probably where this type of economic management falls over. That is, it's very easy for politicians to spend money, to cut taxes when people are finding it tough, increase welfare, but it's more difficult to raise those taxes, to cut the welfare. Yeah. And we've definitely seen a bloating of government spending, but in particular government debt around the world over the last 100 years. Now, this consensus fell apart, like I kind of mentioned before. In the 70s, we had an oil crisis. We had inflation go through the roof. And this is something that led to, businesses losing money, people getting fired, unemployment rising, led to this period of stagflation. And what we realized at this point, in this juncture, just like we realized during the Great Depression, was that the current economic management system had flaws. And in particular, you can't spend your way out of stagflation. That is, you want to reduce unemployment, yeah, but that just exacerbates inflation. If you pump in stimulus at that point in time, there's going to be issues. And so the world looked for a new solution, and slowly but surely we ended up on the latest consensus, which was that economic policy may be better managed through managing the money supply. In particular, taking the control of the ebbs and flows, the stimulus in particular, taking that out of the hands of politicians, putting that in the hands of central bankers, and enacting economic policy through through money supply and through the cost of capital. So that's why the last 50 years or so we've seen deregulation of the financial system, but in particular, when it comes to understanding the economy, we've mainly focused on interest rates. What are interest rates doing? Where are interest rates going? Yeah. And then we had a global financial crisis. This may have been the peak of, this type of policy, that is monetary policy. And we started to get concerns that maybe monetary policy, or that central bankers managing the economy, in particular the financial system being the main engine for economic stability, that maybe that wasn't working for us anymore. Since the global financial crisis, we've moved into probably the next phase, transition, and trying to figure out what comes next. Different theories have been proposed, chief among them modern monetary theory, which may, it's more of a descriptive theory than a normative theory, so it's not necessarily great for prescribing what government should do. But it does tell us that, for example, printing of money isn't necessarily the main driver of inflation, because we spent, especially after the global financial crisis, spent a decade printing money and inflation was low. Yeah. There was a disconnect that we thought would always be there, but it wasn't there anymore. And so we started to think, well, what's going on? How can we be printing so much and not seeing any inflation? But perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. So we did see a lot of price inflation, not in consumer prices, but saw a lot in asset prices. Yeah. Then we got hit with COVID, and then we moved into a classical, supply-driven inflation. That is, supply being hit, demand remaining high and even increasing, and prices going through the roof. So what's next? Where will we end up? In hindsight, we can map out these general, economic and macroeconomic policy settings and consensuses. We're in the middle of a transition, so it's hard to say exactly where things are going. Is it going to be a mix of the fiscal and the monetary, or is there going to be some other mechanisms at play? Yes, only time will tell.
Now, eagle-eyed viewers may have spotted some familiar landmarks in this video, so to play the Where is Dr. Dan game, head over to my Substack to be the first to log your location guess. See you next time.